Thank you for joining us. We have today Aidan Muller, John Schwartz, and Sonia Jalfin, our three superstar think tank communicators. A little bit about them. Aidan is the Digital Strategy Director and a partner at Casper & Clay, a communications agency that helps public policy experts shape conversations that strengthen democracy. Aidan is a journalist turned strategic communications and digital expert, majoring in political affairs. John is the CEO of Soapbox, a creative studio for ideas that matter. They work with forward-thinking organizations to turn knowledge and evidence into social progress. John began, as he said, his career in book publishing. And Sonia is the director of Sociopúblico, a communications studio with a focus on public issues. They work with experts, researchers, professionals, and public officers to bring their ideas to the public. And Sonia is also an award-winning journalist. The three of them have written articles for our annual review, where they reflect on think tank communications and change. And for this conversation, I asked them to prepare a few questions they want to ask each other based on what they wrote. So here we go. The first person who will ask a question is, and I have my little hat. So the first person will be Sonia, and you will ask your question to Aidan.
Excellent. Are you ready, Aidan?
And of course, John, jump in. This is a conversation, so jump in if you want to, but this will kick us off.
Aidan, how should a think tank assess where it is in relation to the general state of the public opinion to later decide if they need to adopt a more advocacy-focused approach, as you propose in your article? So how can we know where we are in terms of what the public opinion is saying?
I mean, that's a very good question, and I think there's there's two ways of of looking at this, or two almost kind of centers of politics. There's the center of politics among the political elite. And the policy questions that get discussed, what you call the Overton window, and that's that's one kind of that's one center of gravity. The other center of gravity is where the general public is, and and a lot of the time, those in history, those two have kind of broadly aligned, but I think in times of of unrest and times of change, you see a misalignment between those two centers of gravity, between the political elite and the general public, and I think that's one of the that's I think one of the main reasons for which we've seen the amount of unrest that we've had over the last 5 years or so, certainly from in terms of Western countries, and so I guess within that is the question, which center of gravity do think tanks align with? Is it with where the political elite are, or is it where the general public are? And I think the last few years have been a bit of a wake-up call for the political elite, who've suddenly noticed that their center of gravity hasn't aligned with the public and have been realigning with them. So I guess part of the answer to this, and I don't profess to have all the answers, but part of the answer to this is going to be, to what extent are think tanks being heard by the political elites? To what extent are they able to impact on decisions that are being made? And so, if they're finding that they're not getting a hearing, if they're finding that the agendas that they're discussing, currently are not are not getting airtime, or if they're finding that the ideas that they're putting forward are not really getting any traction, then there's a question about whether the kind of questions that they're that they're addressing are find themselves within the Overton window of the political elite, with the caveat that resonating with the political elite as I mentioned, doesn't necessarily mean that, like, sometimes it's the political elite that's also, you know, in the wrong place as regard with the general public. So yeah, I'll stop at that. Look at that point, but that's broadly what I'd say on that.
Super. Thank you, Aidan. And now, I don't know, John, if you wanted to add anything, or are we good? Okay, so Aidan, now you get to ask your question to John.
I really enjoyed reading your piece, John, and I completely subscribe to the argument that think tanks need to broaden out the conversation beyond the narrow sphere of what, you know, our own think tank is doing. Can you say maybe a little bit more about why this matters, and do any think tanks stand out to you already as being pretty good at doing this, and what is the first step on that journey? So there's kind of three questions in there.
I think it's you know, it's really important, I think, for think tanks as they turn into more kind of publishers, as I've said in my article, that they need to start thinking about themselves, you know, beyond just pushing a particular party line, a particular policy line, and more as conveners of people in the issues where they are active. And I think that there are certain think tanks that kind of do this quite well. I think Brookings have done this quite well, and actually, you know, have been doing it well for a number of years, and bringing in alternative voices, or widening out the number of people and the breadth of the people that they might bring in. Chatham House is starting to do this really well as well. But where I think, you know, funnily enough, I want to sort of cast my mind back to the time when I was at IPPR, the Institute of Public Policy Research in the UK. In that time, I was simultaneously working for IPPR during the daytime and working for Policy Exchange, which is a centre-right think tank in the UK. And funnily enough, the people back then thought that this was, you know, not just something which, you know, was okay for me to do. They thought it was a positive strength, because it opened channels of communications between IPPR and Policy Exchange, and people from IPPR ended up doing Policy Exchange events, and people from Policy Exchange ended up doing IPPR events. And I don't see that happening as much anymore in think tanks, and I think it's something that has to start happening. I mean, we recently had an incident at the Atlantic Council where they had kind of a division even within the organisation, and I don't necessarily think that was a bad thing to happen there. Maybe they thought it was bad internally when it was happening. I'm sure it wasn't easy for the comms team to deal with. But what it actually shows is the Atlantic Council is a broad church, and that it can deal with all sorts of issues in all sorts of different ways. And I think as in terms of being seen as a think tank which is active in that space, and which is useful in that space, and which you might want to engage with if you are also active in that space, I think that kind of thing broadens out their reach, and I think will be very, very useful to them in an ongoing way. So I think more of that, actually, funnily enough, perhaps not in quite such a controversial way as the Atlantic Council did it, but a little bit more controversy wouldn't go amiss.
Super, thank you. And Sonia, unless you want to jump in on that, John, now you get to ask your question to Sonia.
So, Sonia, I was really interested in the idea in your piece that think tanks might adopt different sort of personalities for different audiences, and that maybe they should actually sort of embrace the chaos that comes with lots of projects and lots of staff trying to address lots of different audiences and different issues. And I think, you know, I've been an advocate for many years now for sort of strong, unified brands for think tanks. Am I wrong about that? And do I just need to relax a little bit, do you think?
I think you just need to relax a little bit in general terms, and me too, probably, and Aidan too. That's another thing. And I think that you're not wrong, but there's definitely a tension there that we as communicators need to start thinking about. I think we were all so sure that we needed strong brands and coherence in communications, and we all worked to achieve that for many years. But now I think that that's starting to crack a little bit, and maybe we should embrace change a little bit more. Trying to be, I think organizations need to be true to their core values, and there's this fundamental stage in which we need to be coherent. But then if we think of this as persons, as individual people, we have our personality, but at the same time, we don't speak in the same way to different people. We have a different tone of voice when we speak, I don't know, to a boss or to a client or to our part of our family, someone, a member of our family. And I think that's true also for organizations. And if we find the right tone to connect to each of those audiences, then our message is probably going to be heard more loudly. And of course, there's a trade-off and there's a balance there, and each organization should find its own. But I think definitely trying to look at this in a more easygoing way might be useful. Sometimes it is just a question of giving the microphone to people in the organization, because in that way, you are not compromising the whole organization identity, but just saying that someone at the organization is today handling the Twitter account, and this person is going to be speaking and sharing his or her opinions. So that's a way to find the balance between the brand and the personal opinion or voice. So I don't have the perfect answer to this, but I think it's something we should look in more detail, and in the few coming years, I'm sure we're going to be talking a lot about this.
Super, thank you. So I know we said one question each, but if there's something you're itching to ask anyone else, please jump in. And I mean, I saw your questions, they're all great, and we had to pick. But if there's something that any of you really want to ask someone else, please do so now.
I can say it's not a question, but I can say I was surprised by how well, I mean, we are all communicators for ideas, and we had all the freedom on think tanks to write on anything we wanted in relation to think tanks and change. And we ended up talking about the same issues from different perspectives. And I think that's interesting because it probably talks about the state of our domain right now. What are the questions that interest us, that question ourselves? So I think it's nice to read the three of them together and like parts of the same puzzle we are all trying to figure out together.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I think that there's a big element, you know, I mean, we're all in our own different ways and with different emphases talking about the ability to let individual voices speak within think tanks, and how, you know, you can use those individual voices, or perhaps use your think tank as a platform for more individual voices to speak up. And I think that there's another theme which, you know, Aidan has touched on really well about, you know, what is the future of sort of impartiality? Is that something which is a reality, and is that actually something which is even engaging for current audiences as well? And then I think that there's this other interrelated piece which I've written about, which is just about, you know, what does good content look like, and how do we produce enough of it and put it in the right places? And all of those questions are totally interconnected. And, you know, I think that the future of think tank communications over the next few years will be decided by how the answers that think tanks come up with to those questions.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I was also actually struck with, like, you know, how much alignment there was, like, you know, in a sense, or like, you know, even though they were all looking at very different things. I think, like, you know, each article in its own way looked at, for example, the need to tap into something bigger, you know, than just, like, you know, the very narrow kind of conversations that, like, you know, that can sometimes happen, you know, in think tank world. And also both, like, you know, completely independently showed, like, you know, an emphasis on or on the growing importance of personal brands, and that was completely without any kind of consultation. And I think that's definitely something which I think brands like think tanks are going to have to, come to terms with in one way or another, and actually not just come to terms with, but actually leverage and and use to their advantage.
Super. This really frames encouraging everyone to read the articles and consequently the annual review. Just one final question. Let's see how well this ages. If you have to think of the next 10 years, or 100, or 5, let's say 10, what key skill do you think a think tank communicator will have to have? We can start by Aidan.
Definitely. I mean, I think 10 years from now is going to be it's quite different, difficult rather to predict. I know that certainly now there's increasingly a need for think tanks, think tank researchers to be more au fait with comms, and I think there's probably going to have to be a certain alignment with comms. Think tank communicators needing to maybe be a bit more au fait with research and the process that that ends up with a piece of research in whatever format is the current one in 10 years time. I do think that in 10 years time there will probably be a little bit more emphasis on the person rather than the function, if that makes sense. There's probably it's going to be a bit more personality driven. That would be my guess, but luckily I'm hoping that if I'm wrong in 10 years time, everybody will have forgotten about my answer.
Super. And John?
I want to actually want to build on Aidan's answer a bit, and I think it's going to be probably even more personality driven than perhaps Aidan has suggested. I do think that many of the most successful think tank communications that I've seen in recent years are to do with helping individual sort of people, individual public intellectuals use a think tank as a foundation for building their own personal profile. So in that sense, I think that your think tank communicator will become a little bit more like an agent, or even someone who's helping out someone who's like a sort of social media star. So you'll find yourself going around with your researcher and sort of, following them around, snapping photos of them for Instagram. Maybe I'm only slightly exaggerating here, but that kind of, so recording what they're doing, editing what they're doing, putting together what they're doing, staging what they're doing in ways that actually help them build their own individual profile.
Super. And Sonia?
Yeah, I agree with. Yeah, I agree with what you've said. I think that probably we will need to know more about how to automate some processes. That's something that's starting, and to separate what's going to be automated and done by the next version of GPT-3s or any AI technology that we're going to be using in 10 years. And at the same time, recognizing what part of our work is still humane, and we need to, and in which parts we need to deal with creativity and innovative thinking. So separating those two, that's something that's starting today, but it's probably going to be a stronger feature of our work in 10 years. And I guess we will retain only the creative part, and the rest is going to be solved. Maybe we will be, as agencies, as communication agencies, agents of change, and we will help organizations incorporate automation or AI. But at a certain point, I think they are going to be ready to do that themselves without our help, and we will be there only for the creative innovative part that's somehow I think it's going to be still needed in 10 years. I don't know after that. Let's say for your 10 years, we are still going to be around.
Yeah, I think what one thing I would want to add to that on the AI piece, certainly Aidan in his article talks about how, you know, in the pre-Gutenberg era, authority sort of came from God, and then in the sort of post-Gutenberg era, we established, publications or sources of knowledge or authorities around knowledge like that, and that those are now the things which are sort of breaking down in the current era. And when I read that, I kind of made me think, oh, maybe AI is going to be the new source of authority. But then I couldn't work out what that, you know, in answer to the question, what does that mean for think tank communicators? I haven't a clue. Interpreting the machine, I guess, in some way.
Thank you, and that's great, and definitely we'll have to revisit this conversation and these thoughts in the coming years. And I think a lot of it will be about staying relevant and, as usual, being able to adapt and be agile and change with what are, you know, public demands and needs from us. Thank you so much. One of my favorite things about my job is that I get to sit with people like you and have these conversations and bring people together. So thanks again so much for your time. And yeah, I look forward to seeing you soon at the OTT conference. And thank you again.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Great talking to you. Bye.
Bye.